In the post-war years, when Europe was just beginning to heal its wounds and new political systems were being established with iron determination, Rudolf Slánský came to the fore in Czechoslovakia. From 1945 to 1951, he held the key position of General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, becoming one of the most influential figures in the country. His influence was so great that few important decisions were made without his approval. He was not just a party functionary, but a true architect of a new political reality, harsh and uncompromising. Imagine Prague in those years, a city that had just thrown off the shackles of occupation, but was already plunging into a new, no less severe ideological struggle. The streets still echoed with the celebrations of victory, but in the corridors of power, the threads of future repression were already being spun. Rudolf Slánský was the one who held these threads in his hands. His office may not have been the most luxurious, but it was here, behind a massive desk, that the fates of hundreds, if not thousands of people were decided. He signed papers, gave orders, approved lists that sent people to prison and sometimes to the scaffold. And he did so with complete conviction in his own righteousness, in the need to purify society of hostile elements. Slánský was not just an executor. He was one of the main organizers and inspirers of political repression and show trials of so-called enemies of the state. At the end of the 1940s, Czechoslovakia was swept by a wave of arrests, interrogations, and trials. People were accused of espionage, sabotage, Trotskyism, Titoism, anything that could undermine the Communist Party's monopoly on power. And every step Slánský took along the way was dictated by direct instructions from Moscow. He was an ideal student of the Stalinist school, demonstrating unconditional loyalty to the Stalinist line, believing in its infallibility, and that this was the only way to build a bright future. He seemed to absorb every word, every unspoken wish from the Kremlin, turning them into directives for the Czechoslovak security services. For many in the party, Slánský was the model of an unshakable communist, a man who would not flinch in the face of difficulties and would spare no one for the sake of the revolution. He knew how to be persuasive at meetings. His speeches were full of determination, and his gaze was firm. But behind this outward steadfastness lay an inner commitment to absolute obedience. In those days, when the word from Moscow was law, and any deviation from the general line was punished most severely, such loyalty was not simply a virtue, but a condition for political survival. The 24th day of November, 1951, arrived. This day became fateful for Slánský. In the evening, as Prague was sinking into the autumn dampness and the few passers-by hurried home, Rudolf Slánský was arrested. It was unexpected, sudden, without any prior warning or hint. The man who had been giving orders that morning, whose words carried the weight of law, suddenly found himself face to face with those he had once sent to make arrests. The door of his house swung open, and state security officers appeared on the threshold, their faces devoid of any emotion. This was not just the arrest of a high-ranking official. It was a personal order from Stalin himself, dictated by the deep-rooted paranoia in the Kremlin. Despite his seemingly unwavering loyalty to Stalin's policies, Slánský found himself caught up in the machinery of the system he had helped to build. There were several reasons for this turn of events, all of which were intertwined in a web of mistrust and suspicion. One of the main reasons was the general paranoid campaign against the so-called cosmopolitans. In the post-war Soviet Union and its satellites, a vigorous struggle was underway against deference to the West, rootless cosmopolitanism, and any manifestations of nationalism that could weaken Moscow's control. In this atmosphere of suspicion, anyone who had any connections outside the Eastern Bloc, or whose origins could be interpreted in two ways, came under attack.
In addition, Moscow needed a scapegoat to explain the economic difficulties and failures in Czechoslovakia. The collectivization of agriculture was proceeding with difficulty, industry was not always meeting its targets, and popular discontent was simmering beneath the surface. Someone had to be held responsible for these problems, and party leaders in satellite states became convenient targets. Slánský, as general secretary of the party, was the ideal figure for such a role. His arrest was intended to serve as an example to anyone who might question the correctness of Moscow's line. Finally, there were suspicions about his supposed independence. Even the smallest initiative, the slightest deviation from strict adherence to instructions from the center, could be interpreted as a sign of disloyalty. Under conditions of total control, Stalin did not tolerate strong, independent figures around him, especially in the satellite states. Any display of charisma or authority beyond what was prescribed was perceived as a threat. Perhaps Slánský, being an experienced organizer, sometimes displayed what the Kremlin considered excessive energy or made decisions that were not directly authorized, and that was enough to get him blacklisted. Thus, Rudolf Slánský, who yesterday was the arbiter of destinies, overnight became a victim. But before he found himself in the dock and then on the scaffold, he was one of those who meticulously built this system, whose wheels mercilessly crushed human destinies.
To understand the full extent of his fall, it is necessary to look at how the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, and with it Slánský, came to wield such unlimited power. After the Second World War, Czechoslovakia found itself in a difficult geopolitical situation. Liberated by the Red Army, it gradually but steadily fell under Soviet influence. The Communist Party, once marginal, quickly gained strength after the war, skillfully exploiting anti-fascist sentiments and promises of social equality. By 1948, tensions had reached a peak. What went down in history as the February coup, or Victorious February in communist rhetoric, was the culmination of this process. Under pressure from street demonstrations organized by the Communists and the threat of direct confrontation, President Edvard Beneš accepted the resignation of non-communist ministers and approved a new government completely controlled by the CPC. This event finally consolidated communist power and opened the door to large-scale purges. It was during this period that Rudolf Slánský, as General Secretary of the party, became a central figure in the apparatus of repression. He was not merely an executor, but the chief organizer. His office became the nerve center from which orders were issued to clean up society of any elements that might challenge the party's monopoly. Under his leadership, the State Security Service worked actively, becoming a powerful instrument of political investigation and repression. An extensive network of informers was created, denunciations were encouraged, and every citizen, even the most loyal, could find themselves under suspicion at any moment. Fear became an invisible but pervasive element of everyday life. Slánský, who came from a Jewish family, joined the communist movement at an early age.
He was a staunch internationalist who had gone through the crucible of underground struggle and emigration to Moscow during the war, where he was closely associated with the Comintern and personally with Klement Gottwald, the future president of Czechoslovakia. This connection with Gottwald was key. Slánský was his right-hand man, a loyal and effective assistant, which allowed him to occupy such a high position. He was a man of action, a pragmatist, completely immersed in party work. He was not particularly charismatic, but he had tremendous stamina and organizational skills, which were so necessary for building a new state based on the Soviet model. He sincerely believed in communist ideals and in the need for harsh measures to achieve them. For him, the enemies of the people were a real threat, and their destruction was a necessity. The wave of repression that Slánský actively directed was comprehensive. Not only former politicians, entrepreneurs, and priests were targeted, but also members of the party itself who could be suspected of deviating from the line. So-called people's courts were created, which were essentially just a smokescreen for decisions that had already been made. The trials were staged, the scripts were written in advance, and the verdicts were often handed down before the hearings even began. People were accused of conspiring with Western intelligence agencies, attempting to restore capitalism, and engaging in subversive activities. The methods of investigation were brutal: sleepless nights, beatings, threats of reprisals against families, staged executions. The aim was to break the will of the accused and obtain a full confession, which was then used for propaganda purposes. When the wheel of repression turned against Slánský himself, he found himself in the very meat grinder that he had helped to create. His arrest, as already mentioned, was the result not so much of his actual misdeeds as of a complex combination of Kremlin intrigues and Stalin's paranoia. Stalin, fearing the growing influence of individual national communist leaders and seeing them as potential Titos, decided to carry out another wave of purges to strengthen his control over the Eastern Bloc. In this context, Slánský, with his Jewish origins and extensive connections, became the ideal target for accusations of a Zionist conspiracy. The charges brought against Slánský and his associates were not just absurd, they were grotesque. He was charged with spying for the West, sabotage, attempts to overthrow the people's regime, and, crucially, a Zionist conspiracy to create a Jewish state under the protection of the imperialists. The irony of fate was that Slánský, like many other Jewish defendants, was completely assimilated and showed no interest in Judaism or Zionism. Nevertheless, the anti-Semitic undertones of the trial were obvious and inextricably linked to the parallel doctors plot unfolding in the USSR, which also featured accusations of a conspiracy by Jewish doctors to sabotage the country. This was part of a broader campaign to combat cosmopolitanism, which in practice often turned into state-sanctioned anti-Semitism. The investigation into Slánský's case lasted almost a year and was a living hell. He was held in a secret prison and subjected not only to physical torture, but also to sophisticated psychological pressure. The investigators, many of whom had been trained by Soviet specialists, used tactics such as sleep deprivation, constant interrogation, humiliation, and threats of violence against his family. He was shown fabricated evidence and testimony from other detainees, convincing him that resistance was futile. Slánský was forced to rewrite his confessions multiple times until he produced statements that perfectly fit the pre-written script. His will was broken, and by the time the show trial began, he was a shadow of his former self, ready to say whatever words were demanded of him. He had to not only confess, but also expose himself and his comrades, proving his guilt to the party and the people. The story of Rudolf Slánský serves as a grim reminder of how repressive regimes can turn against their most loyal servants. His fall from organizer of purges to victim of the gallows illustrates the absurdity and cruelty of the era, leaving an important lesson about the value of human life and justice.